Olá a todas e todos. Eu gostaria de agradecer à equipe organizadora do VIII Seminário de Museologia Experimental pelo convite para participar do evento e mais ainda por poder moderar a mesa de Ana Rueda e ter tido a oportunidade de refletir a partir de sua análise sobre os vários ângulos do tema proposto pelo evento, já que sua apresentação articula uma leitura histórica do papel dos museus no processo colonial e trata também do compromisso, tanto dessas instituições como das práticas artísticas contemporâneas, com a reescrita dessa história. Me parece importante ainda ressaltar o empenho que Ana faz, tanto no seu artigo como na sua conferência, para mapear sentidos e conceitos de comunidade envolvidos nessas práticas, algo que é relevante não só para esse evento, como para as nossas reflexões e ações cotidianas no campo da museologia. Eu começo minha intervenção fazendo referência ao documentário Um Guia Pervertido da Ideologia, que é dirigido e concebido pelo filósofo e sociólogo esloveno Slavoj Žižek, no qual ele analisa as componentes ideológicas dos filmes hollywoodianos mais aclamados pelo público nas últimas décadas. Ele chama a nossa atenção para como algumas questões presentes em obras como Titanic, Laranja Mecânica, Taxi Driver ou mesmo A Noviça Rebelde formam o nosso imaginário e o nosso inconsciente. E ao analisar o romance de Jack e Rose no filme Titanic, o autor avalia o papel positivo do iceberg, já que para ele a verdadeira tragédia, caso aquela colisão não tivesse ocorrido, seria a falta de perspectiva ou a inviabilidade daquele romance. Mas por que eu estou retomando esse documentário e a análise desse filme em específico para pensar junto com Ana? Primeiro, porque na primeira parte do seu texto e da sua apresentação, Ana traça o panorama dos museus europeus frente aos desafios pós-coloniais e nos mostra, desde uma fase de omissão dessas instituições até uma série de mudanças de paradigmas que inclui a emergência dos debates sobre a descolonização dessas estruturas. Me pareceu emblemática a citação que ela faz da pergunta que aparentemente alicerça a reflexão do Museu Peter Rivers em torno da questão: como você pode ser um museu velho e novo, tradicional e contemporâneo? Essa pergunta me faz recordar outra passagem do documentário, quando Zizek aponta que subjaz na relação de Jack e Rose uma característica fundamental das práticas imperialistas coloniais, a de que as pessoas pertencentes às classes hegemônicas, quando estão em crise, buscam contato com as classes e grupos subalternizados para se revitalizar. Partindo dessa máxima, eu me pergunto: seria a agenda da descolonização nos museus europeus e seus aspectos metodológicos, como a participação, a colaboração e o agenciamento comunitário, uma forma dessas instituições, que são coloniais em sua gênese, implementarem processos de revitalização de si? Como as instituições se autolegitimam na medida que dizem legitimar outros saberes que foram, por elas, historicamente silenciados? É nesse sentido que, entre Romance Sem Perspectiva e Icebergs, que eu devolvo a questão posta por Ana Rueda: como pensar as exposições como uma prática decolonial? Como bem percorrido na apresentação de Ana, os museus e seu trabalho de classificação, organização e quantificação das espécies e das culturas foram importantes dispositivos para a afirmação do saber científico e do saber médico como saberes válidos. Esse processo, que é um processo de hierarquização, ele foi tematizado e rearticulado pelo projeto Herbário, do artista Uriel Orlov, apresentado por Ana, e que num processo que nós podemos entender como um esforço por desarquivamento, vai remarcar como a violência dirigida aos grupos colonizados não incidiu somente sobre seus territórios e seus corpos, mas sobre seus saberes e subjetividades, o que os autores mobilizados por Ana, como Miolo e Quijano, vão nomear como violência epistêmica. Ao narrar o processo do artista entre a exposição no museu e um conjunto de práticas de educação colaborativas enunciadas a partir de um espaço independente de arte, Ana nos deixa com a pergunta: o que faz de uma prática artística e, consequentemente, de uma exposição uma prática decolonial? Por que que o processo é enunciado como educacional e a exposição ainda se configura como um produto? Por que o jardim, plantado com base na articulação de uma ecologia de saberes, e de saberes neste caso de cura e de cuidado, continua fora e o herbário continua dentro? Em que medida agir com e em comunidade consegue suplantar a lógica nas quais os públicos são convidados a colaborar com as estruturas e serem transformados por elas, sem que as estruturas sejam afetadas ou realizem processos internos de transformação? Mais ainda, como que nós podemos superar uma economia dos públicos, na qual a experiência e a participação, que a meu ver deveriam ser uma ética, tornam-se uma moeda no jogo das contrapartidas sociais que sustentam os museus contemporâneos e suas multiplicidades de finalidades? É nesse sentido que me parece que Ana nos convida a refletir sobre como os aprendizados e saberes que circulam nessas trocas são nomeados e endereçados para além da centralidade do artista e do museu. Me parece importante questionar ainda que se esses saberes, denunciados como historicamente silenciados, são fundamentais para a existência da obra e da exposição, por que o artista é sujeito e a comunidade é um coletivo homogeneizado? É nesse sentido que a conferência me leva a pensar que não basta que as exposições se pretendam decoloniais ou que tematizem e mesmo denunciem a colonialidade do poder e do saber presente nos museus. É necessário que elas engendrem processos decoloniais. Isso está estritamente ligado à capacidade dos museus de deixarem de falar para redistribuir os meios para a produção de conhecimento no e pelos museus a partir de outras epistemologias. Pois a decolonialidade não pode ser somente o caminho para revitalizar museus velhos que, ao persistirem na tutela dos processos de decolonização, para que com isso sigam, que ao persistirem na tutela dos processos de decolonização, por vezes seguem tradicionais, porém contemporâneos, e correm o risco de impedir a potência do iceberg frente à persistência da modernidade colonial da sociedade ocidental. Eu agradeço pela possibilidade desta contribuição e desta reflexão e desejo que o seminário promova muitas outras interlocuções e conversas. Obrigada.
Hello everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for watching. Based on Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano's compound concept, Modernity Coloniality, in which coloniality is posed as the darker side of Western modernity, this paper investigates the decolonial approach to exhibition making. It concentrates on the potential of exhibitions as decolonial practices that look not only into the matrix of power, as well as its production of racial and gender hierarchies on the global and local levels and their functioning alongside capital to maintain a modern regime of exploitation and domination, but also, following philosopher and semiotician Walter Mignolo, those practices that delve into modernity coloniality and its denial of knowledges, subjectivities, world senses, and life visions. In this sense, I concentrate on the knowledge production processes of the exhibition. I analyze Swiss-born, London-based artist Uriel Orlo's Mafapuke's trial and other plant stories, presented at the showroom, London in 2016. The exhibition was conceived as a botany-centered political proposal that assumed the viewpoints of both South Africa and Europe. The show was part of Teatrum Botanicum, a broader project that delves into the various traditions of plant-based medicine in South Africa, and the ideological and economic confrontation of different knowledge systems, for instance between Bangladeshi and Sudanese communities. First, I examined the exhibition's conceptual herbarium as a critical display strategy, and then I problematized the project's institutional framework, particularly the showroom's community-centered educational program. The central piece, Orlo's two-channel video installation The Crown Against Mafapuke, reimagines and dramatizes the trial of South African herbalist Mafapuke Nkobo and presents scenes of the current practice of traditional medicine in South Africa, including growers, apprentices, traders, and users, in documentary mode. The use of two channels confronts the reenacted past with the present. Nkobo was a licensed South African Inyanga or traditional herbalist, accused in 1940 of untraditional practice. Karen Flint observes that this charge referred to his use of the title of doctor. He described himself as a native medical scientist and also included pharmaceuticals in his remedies, rather than just herbs. Traditional healers usually only served African communities, so Nkobo's main transgression was competing with biomedicine and fostering a hybrid, multi-therapeutic society that obscured the demarcation between white and indigenous medicine. Ultimately, he was found guilty, and the ruling defined traditional medicine as, quote, medicine such as natives can make for themselves by comparatively simple processes, not requiring a high degree of scientific skill, out of the natural substances of the country which are available to them. End of quote. As Flint suggests, this statement reveals the preconception of the divide between rational, scientific, modern Europe and irrational, simple, ritualistic Africa. However, Nkobo's case demonstrates the permeability of the boundary between the two. The rest of the works in the exhibition were organized in a conceptual herbarium. A modular structure showed each piece as a specimen and put together a continent-wide multivocal archive. According to Orlo, this display strategy referred to the overall title of the project, taken from English herbalist John Parkinson's treatise Theatrum Botanicum from 1640, and was a way of reflecting on the research's problematic foundation in Europe. In the exhibition, the herbarium functioned as a critical reflection on the historical display of plants. The origins of natural history collections date back to the cabinets of curiosity of the Renaissance, and the collector's desire to bring all knowledge into a single space. Eventually, the 19th century saw the rise of the public museum, botanical gardens, economic botany collections, and in colonial contexts, world museums that displayed objects from colonized territories. Orlo's herbarium alludes to modern scientific forms of display. Under cold white lightning, the contemporary artworks clashed against the rigid structure, prompting questions about the long history of this exhibitionary model. Imperial expansion saw the emergence of natural history and ethnographic museums, as well as museums such as the Royal Museum of Central Africa in Brussels, the Dutch Colonial Institute in Amsterdam, and the Musée Permanent de Colonie in Paris, which were expressly founded to promote colonialism and its civilizing mission. These institutions were slowly transformed by dealing with the tensions brought by decolonization. An introductory video on the Pitt Rivers Museum website addresses some of these issues, directly asking, how can you be old and new, traditional and contemporary? The narrator speaks about the challenge to reinvigorate the museum's building and to rethink the interpretation of the collections. The short clip makes reference to the institution's work with forced migrants and with the Maasai in their understanding of problematic holdings, and discusses bringing in voices that had been silenced in the past. This critical introduction to the museum mentions the violent use of language on the original labels and the importance of moving forward. Orlo's use of the herbarium highlighted the highly problematic historical role of this type of museum. The Dutch Colonial Institute, for example, became the Indies Museum after the independence of Indonesia, followed by the Royal Tropic Institute and finally the Tropical Museum, which actively concealed its colonial origins for decades. Curator Suzanne Lejeune notes that in the 1960s, the museum's narrative shifted to one of cooperation, development aid, and daily life in the Third World, strictly avoiding any reference to colonial history. However, more recently, the museum has critically reintroduced the subject of Dutch imperialism and colonial collecting. In other cases, colonial museums were transformed into art and ethnography museums which focused on previously colonized indigenous cultures. In France, the Musée de la France d'Outre-mer turned into the Musée des Arts Africains et Océans, MAO, in the 1960s. MAO's collections were moved into the highly controversial Musée du Quai Branly in 2006, and its building was transformed into the Cité Nationale de l'Histoire de l'Immigration. Please forgive my pronunciation here. This transnational context highlights the institution's privileged standpoint and their significant role not only in building the imaginary of the national and the European past, but in taking responsibility for addressing current global struggles and inequalities. The most striking effect of Orlo's juxtaposition of the contemporary artworks with the herbarium was the highlighting of the displays classificatory order. In his analysis of the African Museum in Tervuren, Belgium, Murat Aydemir notes that, quote, "The orderly classification of the displayed objects effectively overrules the visibility and tangibility of the things themselves, which recede in the background as little more than examples or specimens illustrating the authoritative science of the display." That's end of quote. In contrast, by introducing contemporary perspectives, the artworks in Orlo's exhibition challenge the herbarium structure. The display strategy can be seen as an attempt to consider the exhibition as a site of decolonization. This approach investigates pertinent forms of representation that both address the hard truths of colonization and also honor indigenous understandings of history. Revisiting the herbarium alludes to the role of museums in shaping the past as well as the present and the future. At the same time, this approach refers to current efforts to introduce indigenous perspective into the museum through multiple voices and various narratives. At the herbarium's far left and closest to the entrance was a group of photographs by Sobol Agency, a group of Cape Town-based artists, titled "Planting Seeds to Hunt the Wind." It includes Death Mask by Julia Rayham, an image that depicts the use of utililo as a form of magical protection against death. Other images present a ceremonial cleansing process using isidakwa, inanla, wild jam, as well as ilitha, as means to sleep and communicate with ancestral spirits. The series introduces a variety of indigenous contemporary healing practices and locates the plants within this meaningful context. Cooking sections. A duo of practitioners presented Never Die, a moringa cake placed under a glass dome. This work refers to the commitment in 2010 of the 11 countries along the edge of the Sahara to the construction of a Great Green Wall to slow down desertification and preserve fertile land through drought-resistant species such as the moringa. In this case, the plant stands for resistance and for the struggle for survival. The title and form of a cake point to its extraordinary nutritional properties. Gallery assistants offered a piece to the visitors so that they could try the cake's sweet, unfamiliar flavor. The following work, a photograph by David Goldblatt, titled "Remnant of a Hedge Planted in 1660 to Keep the Indigenous Khoikhoi Out of the First European Settlement in South Africa," refers to the garden as the starting point of the South African colonial project. As told by Orlo, the Dutch trading company had a problem with scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, due to its lengthy trips between Europe and India. The need to grow fresh fruits and vegetables led to their arrival at the Cape in 1652. The first acts of colonial violence were building a wall and planting a wild almond hedge, which still exists and was photographed by Goldblatt. The wall protected the colonizers' fruit and vegetables from the grazing cattle belonging to the Khoikhoi. Goldblatt's work was accompanied by Orlo's The Memory of Trees, which includes Milkwood Tree, a photograph of a 500-year-old tree in Woodstock, a suburb of Cape Town, presented as a witness to the killing of Portuguese explorer Don Francisco de Almeida and his men by the exploited Khoikhoi. Later, it became known as the Old Slave Tree of Woodstock, a spot where slaves were beaten and killed. Eventually, it was renamed the Treaty Tree, as a monument to the start of the Second British occupation, succeeding that of the Dutch. Lombard Poplar, another photograph in this series, depicts a tree in Johannesburg that functioned as a landmark for Ruth Fisher's house, a place that offered protection to apartheid fugitives. This selection of photographs plays a significant role in the exhibition. Against the herbarium's backdrop, these works challenge the ethnographic use of photography, for instance, contrasting modern and primitive technology and portraying African realities as unchanging, devoid of temporality and history. In her study of the Kew Museum of Economic Botany, Caroline Cornish argues that photographs supported an imperial narrative of improvement, which was instrumental to colonization and botanical research. She argues that photography represented the presumed superiority of the colonizer and assisted in positioning the latter as best suited to administer territories and their natural and human resources. Photographs were an integral part of the interpretive framework of economic botany museums and instilled scientific authority. Cornish underlines their fundamental role in the curatorial framing of botanical specimens. Photographs signified mechanical objectivity, demonstrated processing methods, constructed a transformative account from cultivar to commodity, and symbolized imperialist control. In summary, they built a narrative of improvement centered on the production of imperial wealth. At the showroom, this device was appended. Rather than acting as illustrative props, the images offer a counter-perspective that complicates the historical account by presenting the trees as central agents in both the consolidation and resistance to colonial rule. The exhibition adopted a post-colonial approach, a stance that responds to the increasingly felt crisis of ethnographic museums since the 1980s, which has demanded the redefinition of its role from the exhibition of other cultures to that of an intercultural meeting point. This moment is mirrored in a shift in perspective within anthropology, the attempt to see ourselves amongst others, a case among cases, a world amongst worlds. The postcolonial perspective deals with the interrelation between past and present, former empires and their colonies, and the proliferation of what theorist and critic Mary-Louise Pratt has identified as contact zones. She defines such zones as, quote, social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination, and their aftermath as they are lived out across the globe today. Rather than concentrating on strategies of inclusion, Mafabuke's Trial and Other Plant Stories investigated the post-colonial concern with the rewriting of history. This perspective involves looking for ways of breaking down the dominance of the exhibition space and highlighting the violence of display. Through its examination of the confrontation and cross-fertilization of various medicinal practices in South Africa, Orlo's project furthers the recognition of what sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos and colleagues call the epistemological diversity of the world. Santos and colleagues note that the dominance of modern science, which supported the ascendancy of the West, involves the suppression of non-scientific forms of knowledge and their social practices. They argue that social emancipation must be based on the supersession of the monoculture of scientific knowledge by an ecology of knowledges. While the political relations of colonialism have been widely recognized and criticized, Santos and colleagues note that colonial epistemic monoculture is still understood as a form of development and modernity, in opposition to notions of underdevelopment, the Third World, and the Global South. In contrast, Orlo highlighted two issues to which sociologist Thokozani Shaba has drawn attention: the disenfranchisement of Africans from their holistic understanding of health and illness, and the potential cooperation between indigenous and scientific medical practitioners. By bringing together a constellation of knowledges, the herbarium proposed learning as a process of unlearning the dominant system of knowledge and representation. Having argued that Orlo's exhibition presented a critical postcolonial approach, we now turned to how the show's institutional framework reveals the project's more liberal aspects. In what follows, I examine the institutional framework in which the epistemological challenge took place. In Mignolo's words, I look into who and when, why and where is knowledge generated. I address the interaction between aesthetic and socio-political spheres in the configuration of the exhibition and its public. The showroom states as its mission: we commission and produce art and discourse, providing an engaging collaborative program that challenges what art can be and do for a wide range of audiences, including art professionals and our local community. Reading closely, there is an emphasis on process and knowledge production rather than presentation, as well as on a participatory outlook, the intention to question boundaries of art and its purpose, and notably, a clear drive towards diverse audiences, differentiated as the art world and the local community. The gallery was previously dedicated to supporting the work of emerging artists. Under the directorship of Emily Pethick between 2008 and 2018, it concentrated on emerging practices and ideas. Evidently, the gallery constantly dealt with the question of its role within the local community and the tension between aesthetic and social realms. The showroom's program occupies a paradoxical position between its institutional status and the endeavor to destabilize established systems of knowledge. Based on Pethick's conversational approach, the gallery was conceived as a site of sustained inquiry, where change was enacted at a micro level. Pethick was determined to challenge stable structures and categories of knowledge through a principle of horizontal knowledge. Social change was envisioned to occur as a ripple effect, which was initiated locally. The gallery's activities are primarily oriented towards its immediate context. Since 2009, the showroom has been located at the Church Street Market and Edgware Road area of London. One of the most deprived wards in the country, it is surrounded by, although disconnected from, more wealthy areas. The neighborhood is home to diverse communities from the Middle East and Africa and has the fourth lowest median household income in London. 50% of children in this area live in poverty. The showroom's move to Church Street was determined by the possibility of working within the area through a more educationally driven program. Here, I specifically concentrate on the gallery's approach to participation and collectivity in relation to the ambition to destabilize the dominant system of knowledge. The focus on the neighborhood's community is most evident in the showroom's communal knowledge program, an initiative specifically oriented towards local interaction. It invited artists to develop collaborative projects within the Church Street community. Led by Louise Shelley, it started with conversations around shared interests and concerns to generate playful and experimental venues for critical reflection on issues at stake locally. The program consisted of 3 artist commissions per year that usually took the form of workshops or long-term off-site collaborations, one of which was developed into an exhibition. The procurement of long-term activities was fundamental to building strong relationships and reflected a keen attention to process. Although the intention was that communal knowledge would inform and exchange ideas with other areas of the gallery, it was nonetheless clearly distinguished from the gallery's exhibitions program and still required for Pethick working on different levels. What does this distinction imply? In the case of Orlov's exhibition, under communal knowledge, the artists develop a cross-cultural medicinal plant garden at 60 Penfold Community Hub, a local care home, and a complementary manual. For the artists, the garden was a way of anchoring the exhibition in the gallery's context and establishing a real dialogue with local communities, as well as activating an engagement with the issues explored by the project. The garden was built in collaboration with gardener Carol Wright, the Church Street Bengali Women's Group, the Penfold Hub Gardening Group, and the Penfold Hub Center. My point here is not to challenge the value of these communal activities. Instead, I seek to question the differentiation and interaction among the exhibitions as aesthetic investigations mainly directed to an art-informed audience, and communal knowledge activities focused on effecting change within the local community. How is the public conceived in each case? Does this distinction reinforce or diminish actual divisions? It is essential to examine the notion of communal engagement put forward by the gallery. Critic and curator Mi-Won Kwon notes the centrality of institutional forces at work in this kind of collaboration. Communal knowledge program curator Louise Shelley described to me her understanding of community as, quote, groups coming together around shared interests to build affinities on areas of common ground, end of quote. Taking a shared interest as a point of identification can be seen, however, as a reductive, essentializing process that implies a self-affirming, self-validating expression of a unified community. As Kwon observes, the institutional, bureaucratic mediating framework remains out of sight. These images of coherence, unity, and wholeness constitute for Kwon an ideal conception of community that overlooks tension and conflict and involves a disciplinary purpose. Therefore, acknowledging the impossibility of an ideal community is the first step to the formulation of alternative conceptions. For Kwon, the idea that the project will affirm the participant community implies the conception of public art as reassuring, useful, and enjoyable. Art is seen as a form of protection and empowerment against alienation and exclusion. The problem is that this notion of empowerment, in opposition to deprivation, obscures the systemic causes of discrimination and marginalization, and risks presenting participants as passive victims. This discussion is particularly pertinent to decolonizing projects like Orlo's. Scrutinizing such formations provides crucial insight into the educational relations at work and whether they support or undermine the exhibition's subversive aims. How would we address the consensual erasure of difference? Philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy's conception of community is pertinent here. He recognizes the paradox of a movement of coming together that simultaneously questions its idealization. Community, in this sense, is grounded in the notion of relationality, in the acknowledgement of its multiplicity and dynamism. Interrelations are constituted by interruptions, disjunctions, and dislocations. Community is conceived as both a problem that involves social and political complexities and as a form of resistance. This contingent, rather than essentialist conceptualization, challenges conciliatory and unproblematic understandings of the public and the contribution of such views to the colonization of difference. Taking this into account, the garden appears as an institutional justification of the exhibition, which at the same time undermines the latter's criticality. The kind of community discussed above entails a distinct pedagogy. I suggest that the educational theorist Noah de Lissoboy's work on the questions that globalization presents to education is highly relevant to decolonial curatorial approaches. De Lissoboy stresses the need to look at the relationship between critical, empowering projects and epistemological frameworks. A central notion to contest is cultural identity. The decolonial perspective demands addressing the complexities of this concept. It puts forward an understanding of difference that encompasses ways of being and knowing that conceive solidarity on this basis. The notion of inclusion is also called into question. De Lissoboy points to the culturally determined space it presupposes. Scholar Rubén Gastambide Fernández has also put forward a decolonizing pedagogy of solidarity that questions the very definition of the human and, subsequently, the institution of forms of inclusion and exclusion and the reinforcement of social boundaries. This pedagogy involves reimagining social relations based on difference and interdependency, rather than agreement and self-interest. He asks, quote, does solidarity require similarity, shared interests, or a common destiny, or can it work in a context committed to an incommensurable interdependency? Does solidarity necessarily imply a hierarchical relationship? End of quote. These are vital questions that can assist in departing from the idealized understanding of community upheld by the showroom's communal knowledge program. De Lissoboy calls for a critical approach that goes beyond a simple questioning of the given and instead assumes a different basis. Marginalized perspectives become the starting point in the process of supplanting a model of inclusion and transforming educational practice. On the one hand, Orlov's exhibition needs to be analyzed as a project hosted by a Western institution, an established exhibition space that can be seen to appropriate other perspectives for its own critical ends. The project does not overcome this problematic delimitation. The exhibition presents a decolonial pedagogy as other systems of knowledge take center stage in an effort not to overthrow, but to decenter the dominant epistemology. On the other hand, however, the development of the garden presents an unproblematic conception of community. The showroom's educational program takes for granted its social development framework. However, the Lissaboi associates the notion of development with a decomposition of already existing indigenous knowledge, resources, and networks. His approach goes beyond critical education to look at development as a frame of democratizing dialogical or critical practices and points to its underlying universalist assumptions. It highlights the reproduction of this logic and its relations of dependency on the teacher, or in this case the artist, who, quote, centrally and indispensably mediates the passage of students to a sophisticated critical curiosity that is able to reflect on the historical situatedness of their own consciousness. End of quote. Although Orlo led the exhibition, there was also a recognizable effort to put forward a more horizontal organization and a diverse collective perspective, both in the incorporation of works by other artists and the involvement of community organizations in the setup of the garden. The artist's ambivalent position is reflected in his suggestion that although he initiated, led it, and shaped it to a certain extent, it was still a collective communal effort. Similarly, regarding his films, he commented that although he directed them and wrote the scripts, they are the result of a collaboration. Hence the need to distinguish between authorship and authority. Still, it is useful to bear in mind the Lissaboi's questions regarding the implications of pedagogical authority. Can the artist assume the position of another participant instead of that of the leader? What kinds of practices can facilitate not only the recognition of an ecology of knowledges, but also a rethinking of educational purpose and meaning? There is a need to diversify principles, questions, and starting points, as well as to challenge the very notion of knowledge. For the Lissaboi, this requires moving beyond the dominant subaltern position and away from what he calls the geography of reason. Only then can border modes of knowledge acquisition and dissemination multiply. This also means shifting the geopolitical focal point of enunciation that is the basis of the teacher's or the artist's or curator's authority. The Lissaboi describes a movement from introducing minority perspectives to the acknowledgement of a global framework. Furthermore, he calls for a departure from the postcolonial introduction of peripheral knowledge to the decolonial option, that is, foregrounding indigenous and non-Western thought as the central starting point of historical investigation. In its epistemological subversion, the exhibition moves towards a decolonial critique. However, the project could also correspond to what feminist writer and scholar Sarah Ahmed calls the fantasy of being together as strangers, where the ethnographer, in this case the artist, is praised for sharing his authority. Finally, the Lissaboi's rethinking of community provides a helpful basis for decolonial curatorial approaches. Community usually refers to negotiation of differences as a unifying effort. The Lissaboi draws attention to a sense of community more closely associated with the common and communism, described as a radical coming together of individuals under the sign of equality. This conception implies a threat to both wealth and privilege within the social order and knowledge distribution structures. The Lissaboi thinks of community as a small way of making new selves and new worlds and discovering new categories and possibilities, that even within their limited visibility, contest the social order. Along with Judith Butler, he considers community spaces in our dependence on each other. He refers to a literal, physical vulnerability to one another that links the concept directly with difference. This understanding is even more relevant in a socially, economically, and politically interrelated, interdependent world. The Lissaboi's conceptualization aims to generate a kind of being together based on this interdependence that moves toward a moment of radical sharing of being that is transgressive and unruly, and confronts the capitalist logic. He stresses the difference between imagining and inhabiting possibilities. In his view, education is not only concerned with a hopeful envisioning of the future, it can also be grounded in the present. This pedagogy of community takes place fleetingly as a moment of constitution of a different world that can burn holes in the fabric of the given. As a practice, it demonstrates demonstrates the persistent and ineradicable agency of people. This constitutes a demanding proposition that is nevertheless worth pursuing. The conceptual herbarium functions as a self-reflective display strategy and the means to deal with the problematic historical display of plants in Europe from a post-colonial standpoint. The presentation of contemporary artwork within the herbarium structure reveals some of the challenges that decolonization presents to exhibition making. For instance, that of rethinking the relationship between past and present. In this case, photography assumed a fundamental role in directly confronting ethnographic exhibition techniques. Most importantly, the herbarium sparked a process of unlearning and brought about an epistemological challenge to the Western worldview. However, my analysis of the exhibition's institutional framework highlighted the inconsistencies embedded in the showroom's distinction between its art world and local audiences, its exhibitions and educational program, and Orlo's show and medicinal garden. Decolonial exhibition making involves questioning our understanding of communal engagement, inclusion, development, authority, and knowledge. This paper also puts forward a conception of community based on difference and interdependence as a valuable option that can support audience-building practices. Thank you very much for listening.